So let's take a look at the different parts of the brain that are involved in different tasks that we use. One of the things that your book talks about is a study using factor analysis, so a statistical technique to see what categories emerge when components of intelligence are studied. And it turns out that they find 3 capabilities: linguistic, logical mathematical, and spatial. And so if we focus on these 3 different areas, we can learn a little bit about how the brain is involved in each of these. Linguistic capabilities tend to involve, first off, the left hemisphere of the brain more. So this is true for the great majority of individuals who are right-handed. It is still true, but not quite as strongly in individuals who are either ambidextrous or left-handed. So if you're a right-handed person, you're pretty certain that for you, language will be on the more concentrated in the left hemisphere. But if you're a left-handed individual or you're ambidextrous, there's just a lower certainty that for you it's also left hemisphere. And we know that the frontal lobes are certainly important in language, and the temporal lobe, right? So left frontal and the temporal lobes are involved in linguistic abilities. Logical mathematical abilities use different parts of the brain. Generally, the prefrontal and the parietal cortices come up a lot. Left prefrontal is more involved in rote calculation. So if you have to, figure out what is 6 times 7, and remember that's 42. That's a rote calculation. You're just retrieving that from memory, and that's going to use more of the left prefrontal cortex. In contrast, the parietal cortex is going to be more involved in active calculation. The harder it is, the more of the parietal cortex will have to kick in and get involved. And we also see here in this image that estimation, so active estimation, is involving more of the parietal cortex, and you see more of this left and right, whereas calculations from memory are generally using more of that prefrontal, the left prefrontal cortex shown here. In general, when people are solving math problems, they use both the prefrontal areas and the parietal areas. As the problems get harder, the parietal areas get more involved. Speedy performance, though, uses the prefrontal areas more. Males and females also use different areas in some cases, but with comparable performance results. Spatial skills generally use the right parietal structures. This kind of makes sense because remember, parietal cortex is all about place. And so if you're having to imagine and do mental rotation of objects and things like that, those kinds of spatial tasks are going to use this part of the brain that is very familiar with location and spatial layouts already. Let's take a look at the origins of intelligence now. Estimation of quantity is seen in infants and in monkeys and lots of other species. Your book on page 381 has a nice section called "We Aren't the Only Tool Users." There they describe how mirror neuron activity is observed when a monkey as well as human will observe somebody else using the tool. So if you're watching someone use a tool, there's going to be mirror neuron activity in your brain, and we see the same thing in monkeys. There is one difference though. In humans, there's also activity in the anterior parietal lobe, but not in monkeys. So we see here this activity in the anterior parietal lobe. So there are some differences in brain activity while observing tool use in others. Now let's take a look at the interesting issue of how intelligent are other animals.
Do you think horses can do math? Because there was this one horse named Clever Hans who supposedly could solve problems like 2/5 plus 1/2. I don't know how, but he gave the correct answer 9/10 by tapping his hoof 9 times and then 10 times. And he even answered questions posed by random audience members, not just his master. He was a bit more shy around strangers, but that's understandable because, quote, of affection on the part of Hans, who for the last 4 years had had intercourse only with his master. I'm so immature. Anyway, this horse was quite a sensation. He was featured in the New York Times in 1904, and then a commission was formed to see if Hans really could do math. And as the New York Times published later in 1904, expert commission decides that the horse actually reasons. You have to read that article. I can't believe that 13 smart people all thought this horse could actually solve problems like 2/5 plus 1/2. I can't even do that. I haven't gotten to fractions yet. Luckily, one person was not convinced. His name was Oscar Funkst, and he tested this horse much more thoroughly and wrote a 200-page book on his findings. He found that people were unconsciously giving the horse subtle cues when he got close to the correct answer, like jerking their head up a little bit or looking tense. So, if the person asking the question didn't know the answer, Clever Hans didn't know the answer either. But guess what? The trick is still done today.
Hey, Nugget, we're right over here. Go ahead, 6 and 6. You right?
Maggie, honey, what's 2 times 3? And she counted to 6.
For a long time after this Clever Hans incident, all the scientists were very skeptical about animal intelligence. Maybe if this Clever Hans thing never happened, more research would have been done by the time Jean Piaget was around, and Piaget wouldn't have thought children were born blank slates, and his theories wouldn't have influenced educators, and educators wouldn't have ruined math for an entire generation of students. But that was my last video. Anyway, here's what Monsieur Piaget has to say about animals doing math. If mathematics was preformed, we would have to go back to the invertebrates to find the source of mathematics. I'm so glad you said that, Piaget, and I really wish you were still around to see this. Invertebrates can do math. Okay, sort of. They have a sense of numbers, though, just like us. Honeybees can not only differentiate between patterns containing 2 and 3 elements, but can also use this prior knowledge to differentiate 3 from 4 without any additional training. And a weird experiment on desert ants suggests that they actually count how many steps they take to get to their food and then use that knowledge to walk the same number of steps to get back to their nest. How do we know that? Well, you have to watch this dorky cartoon from NPR.
Some German and Swiss scientists think that ants have
pedometers in their brains.
Yeah.
The scientists put some ants on stilts. I didn't even know you could put ants on stilts. So that way they would take longer steps. And for another group of ants, they cut off part of their legs so they would take shorter steps. The ants on stilts took the same number of steps back home and walked past their nest, while the stumpy-legged ants took the same number of steps and stopped before they got back home. And so the best explanation we have is that apparently ants can count.
Yeah.
I want my legs back.
Oh, and here's another one of my favorite studies. They compared guppies to college students and found that the students and guppies showed almost identical performance patterns. Okay, maybe not identical. The student test didn't involve any swimming. It was actually very similar to the test I took at panamath.com, where you have to choose the larger of 2 sets of dots. The fish, on the other hand, were placed in a tank like this and tended to swim to the group with more fish. Both students and fish can distinguish numbers up to 4, and beyond that, we both rely on the ratio between the groups. So for example, distinguishing 6 from 24 is easier than 6 from 8. And with training, some animals can do way more than that, like Ayumu the chimpanzee, and even Alex, the African gray parrot.
Listen. How many? 4 is right.
This system, this gut sense of number, is something it's evolutionarily very old. I mean, rats have it, pigeons have it.
Ants have it, bees have it, fish have it, and lions, birds, monkeys, apes, dogs, cats, dolphins, bears, raccoons, elephants, and sea lions have it. Salamanders try to eat the video showing more flies. Baby chicks choose a larger group of balls. Horses can't add fractions, but they can tell the difference between 2 and 3. And I bet that penguins and giraffes and velociraptors and all other animals have it too. It's not just us.
So it seems that lots of species have a good sense of numbers.